Joining me today, we have an awesome group of speakers, including Brandon Carson, the Global Head of Learning, Leadership, and Cultural Experiences at Starbucks. He is also the founder of L&D Cares, a nonprofit, and the author of L&D's Playbook for the Digital Age. We also have Ryan Austin, CEO of Cognota, and Ellen Burns-Johnson, Lead Learning Strategist of our Growth and Strategy team here at Viable Learning. That was a mouthful, but luckily that's all I have to say. And now I will let our awesome speakers take it away.
Right. Thanks, Stephanie. I'll jump in here first. So first of all, can everyone hear me okay? Want to just see, okay, I'm getting thumbs up from Brandon. Awesome. So just to kind of kick us off and frame up what we're going to be talking about today, I thought we'd start with a Super Bowl metaphor. Not my forte, but it is current events. So I wanted to kind of lean on the football metaphor for this. So, when you're watching the Super Bowl, you're watching a football game, the coaches, the players don't exactly know how the game is going to play out. They have to be ready for anything, right? And so they have a playbook that helps them learn, and adapt to what's happening on the field live as it's unfolding. And so today we're going to be talking about the concept of a playbook for L&D. We'll go into why it's a good approach for L&D strategy, and we'll talk about how to craft a playbook for your organization. So what we'll do, I think Brandon's going to be giving us a lot of the fundamentals, and Ryan will be helping to talk about how we can operationalize a playbook once we've kind of got it defined. And I'll chime in occasionally with some big questions. So, Stephanie introduced me as a lead strategist at ELB Learning. In a nutshell, that means I just like asking tough questions, but hopefully those tough questions get us to the right solution when it's time to actually pin one down. So I'll pause it here and maybe pass it to Brandon. Brandon, did you want to add anything else about your perspective on today's session, or should we jump right into it?
No, I'm completely excited about talking about this, and we'll make it as interactive a dialogue as we can. But yeah,
Okay.
Totally excited. Let's get going.
Sounds good. Okay, so I want to kick us off with a big question. And that big question is basically, there has been this convergence of a lot of really big factors. If we're thinking about, the football metaphor again, there have been some big developments on the field. We had a global pandemic, it's kind of still unfolding. And we've also had some crazy advanced technology hit the mainstream in recent months. So how have this convergence of these factors reshaped our approach to L&D, or the way the different organizations are approaching L&D? And I want to, explore how fundamental are these changes. So can you speak to that a little bit?
So let me just jump in with a little bit of context. And so on February 7th, 2020, I was presenting at ATD's TK conference in Vegas. That morning, I was listening to the news. Now, granted, in 2020, on February 7th, I worked at Delta Airlines. And so I was actually scheduled to travel to China in early March on a business trip. On February 7th, 2020, that morning, I was listening to the news, and the Johns Hopkins Medical Center had just released a new dashboard they created to track this new disease that we were hearing about spreading in China. So I captured this screenshot you see here. Those were the stats as of that morning. The reason I captured that from that dashboard was my talk that morning was about how China was building over 19 megacity clusters, of which Wuhan was in one of them. And then how these clusters were changing the world was some of the topic of that day. And you can see those numbers, like that was way early on, right? That was at 5:44 a.m. on February 7th, 2020. I share this because few of us in business, granted I was at an airline, had a playbook for a global pandemic. I doubt there was one CEO in February of 2020 who would have said their businesses were able to move to all remote work at all. And yet many of them did just a few weeks after this. The morning I shared this data, we all thought the virus would be contained within China's borders. And I remember the travel plans I had were still on track. But as we know, the pandemic altered humanity in many ways, and it completely changed what people want and expect of their work. And that's how we've gotten to where we are now in kind of this confluence of, living through the tech tsunami and a global pandemic and its impact it's had on the people practice. And so that sort of sets the stage for the idea of this new L&D playbook, if you will. It's not just the pandemic, and it's not just the tech tsunami, it's the conflation of both of them. But if you look at these three technologies, AI, the cloud, and data, they're the underlying drivers of the tech tsunami that's brought us to where we are. These innovations have had a profound impact on how business delivers products and services to customers. And they're changing business and workplace rules forever. I mean, AI, have we all just heard nothing else other than AI over the last year and a half? But given this, how can you imagine the old HR and L&D operating model accommodating the new world we're in? Both the pandemic and the tech tsunami, as we know, fundamentally altered the HR practice as well within organizations. Corporate L&D is re-architecting itself to meet the rapidly evolving needs of the business and the workforce. I mean, we're just coming off of this idea of the last couple of years talking about skills. Now we're talking about AI. It's almost like we're just being hit with this tsunami of stuff, right? The onslaught of all of this shows us how the next 5 years is going to be much more transformational than the last 50.
Yeah, those are all really good points as well, Brandon, and agree. It's a lot of information to digest, especially in the context of playbooks and strategy on how you should be looking to operate. And so this particular slide here really talks about mapping out your playbook, looking at the different operating models that you might be considering. It doesn't need to be ADDIE. We just use this example here because people are familiar with it. Could be SAM, it could be Llama, it could be a combination thereof in your playbook, right? Versus being rigid. And something to think through to the group here is how do you know where to add AI? What is that operational journey? And also going through exercises like this with your overall playbook strategy to look at where can we add standardization and processes on how we operate.
100%. 100%. If you look at the paradigm shift in the ways of working and how many of us are kind of exhausted with this return to office conversation, right? That has totally consumed us the last year and a half, 2 years. But we've definitely had a paradigm shift in the way of working. And so the need to support business continuity, as well as the chaotic and confusing workplace challenges that arose from the pandemic and the tech tsunami we're under, they've forced new imperatives for training operations to come forward. We're all living that. Many L&D teams found themselves needing to quickly pivot and around what I call these 3 R's. And this is really what we're doing. And a lot of us are intentional and we know we're doing it. And some of us are doing these things because we've just been forced to because of the new dynamics and ways of working. I call these the 3 R's. First is reset. We have to adopt new rules for almost every aspect of designing and delivering learning experiences. Even though through the crisis and the initial chaos, training operations did not cease. Again, I was at an airline. We did have to put a lot of our business to sleep. We put it to rest because who wants to travel in a little metal tube, with a lot of humans when there's a global pandemic going on? Not very many. But at the same time, we were an essential service to the nation. And so we needed to continue to operate. And when you are in a regulated environment, you must continue to train and develop people. And so in those highly compliance-driven industries, training became the key catalyst of business operations and business continuity. And so my team, many teams found themselves needing to quickly create virtual training strategies, for example, when they were, we were all required to abandon in person. And so a lot of us, again, like I said, didn't have a playbook for this, but we really worked to kind of reset our operating model. And then at the same time, we had to rethink the roles on L&D teams. And we need to continue to do that as we're coming out of the emergency of the pandemic, but really moving into redefining our role in building capability for the ways of working and how business is changing. So we need to assemble plans for increased digital learning, for increased different types of facilitation, coaching, and mentoring. And then the third R, rebuild. We had to rebuild in a lot of ways our mission, vision, and operating principles with new responsibilities, a lot more focus on ways of working and well-being and mental health and all sorts of different types of programming that may not have been central to our operating model in the past. So constructing a new playbook helps formulate a strategic framework to enable these three R's. And during this process of reconstruction, it's important to identify the underlying assumptions about how the business views L&D and, where necessary, challenge those assumptions. L&D must continually expect and prepare for constant change. That's kind of our world now. Look at AI over the last year and a half. We must begin to be comfortable with being uncomfortable in some respects because we're challenged like no time in our past to provide measurable business value. And so this is a time to position L&D candidly as the center of workplace transformation. And that's really why we have a need to re-architect our practice and create a new operating system to become more nimble and adaptable, which is the foundation for a new playbook for L&D. And as mentioned earlier, playbooks can differ based on the needs of your organization. I like the sports metaphor to it, though, because it needs to be pliable and flexible based on what's coming your way. But many of them have similarities, including, I think it's really important to have a mission and vision aligned to the company's broader goals, a current assessment of your L&D operating model, and the state of the learning culture across the company and how L&D impacts both the workforce in the business. And I would say let's consider some key conditions and questions as you begin creating this new playbook. Candidly, the primary institution that provides the top talent for business is our education system, which is based on a 300-year-old British system designed to mass develop specific skills, not necessarily capabilities, in people who would be performing very similar jobs. The current education landscape is challenged with trying to evolve to meet the needs of the digital age. It was created in another time for the needs of a different world. So now you've got to combine that with our corporate training operating model, which was also created in the manufacturing age. Its legacy is that of an industrialized system designed to produce workforce efficiency and standardization. It wasn't designed to build capabilities needed in the digital age. So the question for you is, how can L&D lead the effort to ensure a highly capable workforce in the digital age where the skills gap for the workforce is now permanent? We'll never be able to close that skills gap with how tech is evolving and new ways of working are evolving. So that's leading us to operate L&D in a one-size-fits-all model when really we need to be in a one-size-fits-one model. And so this is the fundamental challenge that we're all facing. And when you look at business technology integration year over year, should that inform us how we adapt? So let's consider how you need to leverage technologies that business uses for its customers for your workforce. How are you integrating learning technology? How are you doing when it comes to using that technology in L&D, and what impact will it have, and what responsibility do you have to integrate that into your practice? So those are just some fundamental questions. And then if we go forward, here are some key questions that I think are important for a flexible and pliable playbook to answer. And really, when you look at it, what are the critical skills and capabilities the workforce needs today and over the next several years? How are you getting that information, and how are you processing that and folding that into your playbook? What are the most pressing concerns for the L&D function today so it can proactively operate as a business partner? Proactively is really a critical point there. And then how should L&D professionals support the digital transformation occurring across the business? As we know, like I just said, the technology gap is always going to be there. You're not going to close that. How are you going to enable continuous learning so that skills can constantly be that people can gain the skills they need to continue moving forward in the business as it evolves. And then how can we move L&D from being a cost center, often starved for resources and challenged to meet business and workforce needs, to presenting evidence of its contribution to the bottom line, candidly? I mean, those are the big questions that a playbook can answer. Overall, the key reason for creating a playbook is that it establishes a better way to enable decision-making based on both solid extrapolations of past experiences and smart estimates of what the near future holds. Going back again to that pandemic example at the airline, we didn't have a playbook for that. Our CEO even said we didn't have a playbook for this, right? So we need a playbook for emerging needs and adaptable and flexible things that are going to come your way from a capability building standpoint. It doesn't mean you negate future predictions entirely. We just need to be able to make those and understand that there's many possible futures in our companies, and planning needs to be weighed against the plausibility and probability of any or all of them occurring. So both near-term and long-term planning each have their strengths. It's best to combine these into a method that provides a framework for scalability with the process for adapting to the inevitable change that's likely to emerge, which is your new playbook. It's a way to formulate a sensible strategy to drive workplace imperatives from a tactical execution standpoint. The core idea of the L&D playbook is to construct a meaningful model of alignment with both the business and the workforce to meet their immediate needs and to derive appropriate scenarios to identify the possible future of both. And I'll just say again, when you think about creating your new playbook, think about these questions as well. Will your playbook address both that short-term and long-term strategy? How will senior leadership be involved in the creation of your playbook? Will you be able to present it to them? Hopefully, yes, and hopefully it's a part of the broader business strategy. Do you see a need for the potential of multiple playbooks with different scenarios? What review cadence will you use to periodically review your playbook?
Thanks, Brandon. So I think we're getting some questions teed up in the chat right now, but I have a big one for you while we take a little break to hear from our participants. And that is, okay, right. Any given element of an L&D playbook, we're going to need to balance our potential returns on that investment or investments that are part of that playbook with the risks of those solutions becoming outdated or irrelevant in the face of these unforeseen future challenges, right? The rapidly changing technology landscape, the tsunami, as you called it, and of course, just any other, incidents that can affect the global, our global society and economy. So what are some additional questions we can ask ourselves as we're thinking through our L&D playbook that will help us strike the right balance between those two forces?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And even in our chat, I'm sure a lot of people will have some thoughts on this. But one of the key things that I'm working on in the role I'm in now, and even in a prior role, was how do we, being the people practice is what I like to call it, because it's not just L&D. There's also kind of the broader HR function, which in some regard can be looked at as candidly the center of transformation right now, because even though a lot of our companies are investing really assertively and aggressively in AI types of technologies and automation types of technologies, nothing really works without the humanity in the work being a central focus. And so what's imperative for us in the people practice now, in my opinion, is to really try to get in front of the business a little as it's moving, and it's moving at a really rapid pace. And so you can see lots of initiatives around, hey, how do we integrate this technology into the flow of the work so that it improves customer satisfaction and improves product and service creation, all of these kinds of things that it'll do. And so we're going to have to be in front of that, candidly, as much as we can. A lot of times we say we need a seat at the table. I think we have some conversation about that coming up. I was talking to Mark Ramos, the CLO at Cornerstone, and he said, no, Brandon, we are the table. The people practice is the table. And so we're setting the table. And so in a lot of ways, it's up to us to make sure that we're in front of the business a bit so that we can see what are the capabilities necessary to be able to drive these intentional strategies that are being derived. And now every CEO, when they lay their head on the pillow at night, they're concerned about capability of the workforce, right? And so that's our call to action, I think, to this. And that's why I advocate a playbook that is pliable. And we'll see an example of one coming up. But you're going to have a lot of unforeseen challenges and pivots in the business, especially as customers are expecting more and more. And so how do we get in front of that more than being this reactive sort of 2 or 3 steps behind it?
Right. So when you're saying getting in front of it, really what you're talking about is positioning L&D at the center of this ongoing organizational transformation that has continued. Organizations always transform and they always will, but let's be at the center of that. Let's be in front of it. Let's help drive it rather than reacting to it, like you just said.
Yeah, 100%.
Ryan, did you want to add anything to that before we move on?
I think one of the main statements that Brandon shared was playbook or playbooks. And I think it's really important, especially in today's world, and we've seen year over year, the world change so fast, whether it's, things happening just globally or technologies that are transforming corporations. And so the most important part is to never be rigid, to be agile, and to also think in the concept of minimal viable products always. So to the point about how much do we invest, the answer should be the absolute minimal until we prove things out and iterate from there, right? And so I loved what Brandon said about playbooks, because you might have an L&D playbook for different scenarios, and you need to understand when to pull on the different playbooks for the different business scenarios that might happen as a learning and development function.
Love that.
All right. So Brandon, you have kind of a deeper dive into an example for us.
Yeah. So if here's an example of a playbook I created when I led the training team at Delta Airlines I was talking about. That you see, this is a 3-year plan covering 2019 to 2021. And I created it in late 2018 to prep us for the next year. Now, what happened in 2019 was interesting because 2019 became the most traveled history, or the most traveled year in human history since we've been keeping records. More people moved themselves around the earth than they had done ever before. And actually, in the summer of 2019, in June, there was one day where Delta, on its own as an airline, moved over 705,000 people around the earth in a 24-hour period. And so when you think about that and the operational excellence necessary to make that happen, it's pretty amazing to think that that many humans got from point A to point B in a 24-hour period. And let me preamble this, because in February of 2020, we were, like I said earlier, I had a trip planned to China, to Singapore, to other places around the world, business as usual, doing our thing. We still thought, hey, this will be contained in China, that we'll still be able to travel, might have to take a couple of weeks of no travel, whatever it may be. But as Ed, our CEO, said later that year, we had no playbook for a global pandemic. So this playbook you see here on the screen was instantly changed in March of 2020. All the items you see connected to the 4 goals for 20 and 21 instantly stopped, which is a critical tenet behind having an adaptable playbook. It's important to note, too, that this playbook emanated from the 10-step process we used to create it. So like in the book I wrote about this, there's a whole detailed process about what to go through to create your playbook. And when I talked earlier about being in front of the business, part of that is what we call the strategic needs analysis that you do as a learning organization to understand even beyond the rhythm of the business, but deep into the nuances of not necessarily how the work should get done, but how it does get done. Because as we all know, there's some interesting nuances between how it should get done and how it actually does get done. And as an organization building a viable, expandable, flexible, adaptable playbook, you need to know not only the rhythms of the business, but what's actually going on deeply in it. We calibrated our learning teams to those business needs. You see on the left, I've got these goals and objectives. The fourth goal is about modernizing and optimizing the learning function itself, which included assessing our team's capabilities to deliver on what we knew was going to be a really impactful 2019 because of the busyness of it all and the fact that more and more people wanted to travel. We did not have a plan for what actually happened in 2020 when we put the business to rest, but still had to function in a regulated environment. But we look at the fact that the entire playbook was disrupted. The needs changed, obviously, so we pivoted. Our broader strategy, however, that the four goals came from actually remained. The lesson here is to realize the North Star that forms the foundation of your playbook may not change. But next to that, you should have a flexible playbook that aligns to the critical programs you want to deliver on and that business value connected to it. It should be kept as simple as you can. This team that I had here that was doing all of this work, they were responsible for training and performance support for all the 350 airports that we operated in around the world, which covered about 50,000 employees. And this is, in some respects, a simple kind of plan when you look at it. Now, there's lots of nuances under each one of these. But what happened was we don't plan, I never thought to plan longer than 3 years. Now some of the planning is in months versus years. But you need to have this North Star that you're shooting for, right? And that you're aligned to and driving to from the business perspective. So this is just an example of that.
Brandon, you mentioned as well how L&D automatically has a position at the table, and that L&D is the table. And I really agree with that comment and concept as well. L&D has a lot of leverage in this great world of the reset or the reprioritization, depending on who you talk to. You'll hear different terms. And that is because of the speed of digital transformation and the speed of technology change that is happening right now is putting big holes in corporate planning right now. Meaning, at the table, the C-suite might be talking and planning, this is where the business is going to be in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years for really big companies. Some of the biggest companies in the world even have 10-year plans. But what's really interesting is that most of the barriers or where the riskiest parts to execution of those plans lay right now is in the skills, right? And the competencies. So there's huge risk to some of these plans to execute effectively because of the skill gaps and the barriers to entry to actually get there. And that puts L&D in a position of strength to have that seat at the table. So it's really important to first off know what's being discussed around the table, and then for L&D to be that strategic advisor to the business to say, hey, everyone, it's really great that we have those objectives and those plans, but here are some risk and some things for you to think about that will prevent us from getting there if we don't bridge this. They'll then come to you and say, how do we do that? Brandon, how do we do that, Ellen? Right? So it puts you in an automatic seat at that table to coach the organization on how to do that. And the timing for this is amazing because there's a lot of tailwinds in the industry right now, enabling for the first time for L&D to become that catalyst for performance and growth to the business. So when you're thinking about your playbook and you're thinking about your operating model, it's really important to, regardless if you're central, decentral, federated, or a hybrid operating model as an L&D team, to be agile and to structure yourself both from a top-down perspective, so positioning yourself around the table, really understanding and getting to know what that 1 year, 3 year, 5 year corporate plan is, and teaching the company where there might be gaps aligned to skills and talent that you as that functional leader can address for the business. And then also bottoms up. You want to build a bottoms up partnership model with the functional leaders. Now, in very big companies, you might say there's too many functional leaders to partner with all at once. So that's where that top-down strategy of really understanding what the priority areas are for the company, the 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, matters the most, because that will also help you prioritize which business functional leaders to go and partner with first, right? If it's a strategic objective to increase or to reduce health and safety incidents, then you're going to go and partner with the health and safety leaders first. And so by putting yourself in the middle of a top-down and a bottoms-up operating model, you're positioning yourself to advise and to lead through talent challenges and to become solutionists to solving these problems for the business as well. And a lot of the times we're hearing companies talk about, well, we don't have the capacity to do this, or we don't have the right tools. And an operating model isn't just about how you structure yourselves, and a playbook shouldn't just be about that as well. It's also about how do you streamline operations to have the speed and have the scale. Too many times we see L&D teams saying, you know, the only way to unlock this performance is to get access to more resources, more budget. And we often say, well, you should first look at your operating layer, the tools you use. Look at it in a framework where these things work together holistically rather in silos or in disparate systems. Because if you focus on the operational improvements first, or going back to mapping the way you operate and looking for areas of improvement that AI can even enhance capacity on your team, then you're going to unlock performance without having to go and ask for budget or additional headcount. And so you should always focus there. Where are the inefficiencies in how we run our learning operations? Where can we improve effectiveness in tying these things better together so that we can work smarter and not harder? And how do we tighten our business partnerships across the organization so that we can be those learning advisors, strategic learning advisors to the business, both top down and bottoms up, and help them prioritize what people programs or learning and development programs to focus on first that will have the biggest impact in the organization. And that's where the magic can start to happen. We've even seen in some cases where L&D truly didn't have the resources and the capacity. They already fixed the inefficiencies in their operating layers, but business partners were coming to them with priority requests that L&D just didn't take on because it might be a priority for the business, but it wasn't ranked the highest priority. But in that case, we've seen L&D teams go back to those business partners and say, we don't have the resources to do this, but if you open up your budget and your resources, we can get there faster with you. And if it's a priority, often you'll see that happen. And so this is where you'll want to look at the different operating models. And to Brandon's point about playbooks being agile and flexible, it seems, you know, it's an interesting topic of discussion because your operating model should also be flexible and agile. And Brandon made a really good point about how that works in the situation with Delta, where they quickly pivoted their operating model and stopped some projects based off of new priorities and new strategies for the company that became the priority. And so when you're thinking about your operating model, you really want to evaluate your current structure to understand the strengths and the weaknesses, and think about how you're organized. The way you're organized is extremely important to align with business priorities. And also think about how the right model will unlock performance for your L&D team to optimize resources where they seem impossible sometimes. So there's different models to think through in that regard: centralized, decentralized, federated, and hybrid models. And there's no one right reason or way to do this. And it's okay for you to be in one model and pivot to the other as business models change. And this is where the concept of a learning operations framework can also come into play to help you think strategically on how to enable better business alignment, more efficient learning operations, and have better and clearer oversight on your L&D programs that align to the business. And again, instead of evaluating each of the processes like the disparate systems slide we showed earlier on separately, you want to think about how these elements and processes work holistically together. And that's where systems thinking can come into fruition. So we look at a framework in 5 stages: align, plan, deliver, measure, and optimize. And there's many other elements that can go into these buckets, but some of them are aligning L&D strategy, aligning your operating model, your business partnerships, thinking about how you plan your learning programs, how you prioritize those, how you measure capacity and budget in part of your decision making and thinking through this, how to be outcomes focused to design backwards into the right learning solutions, prioritize projects and how you deliver these experiences, and the things you can do early in the aligned phase, in the aligned stages, to ensure that you have the right tools and processes and you've answered the right questions to measure the impact of your learning and tell the right stories ultimately.
So we have a question in the chat that I'll get to. I think Brandon's typing an answer now. We can answer that one live. But I do want to ask you, Ryan, to weigh in on this big question. And that is, when it comes to learn ops, right? The slide we were just looking at, I can pull it up again in a moment. But I'm curious if we can't get slightly more specific for a moment and just think about how that might take shape in an organization that has different disparate groups, perhaps, that have very significantly different cultural norms or different structures across divisions and departments. So how can we, in that kind of context, how can we ensure access to L&D resources and opportunities for all employees, no matter which part of the organization they're coming from? Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, it's definitely a big question. And to me, again, it's about having flexible models and operating models to support different scenarios. So in this specific scenario, you have an organization with different cultural norms from different business partners. So often you'll see maybe a federated or a hybrid learning operations model in a situation like this, so that you have different learning team members supporting different partnerships, so that learning can cater as well to those different cultural norms that could be bottlenecks. So again, you have to be flexible to actually address the business challenges. And a lot of the times in a situation like this, a strategic intake strategy might be very helpful, where you can operationalize different requests from different partners coming to the right learning and development teams. And it's very important that in a situation like this, that L&D team members have skills around conflict or consultation skills to address the different business partners in that regard. But I would see, from a structural perspective, a federated model probably working best in a scenario like this. Does that answer part of the question, Ellen?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly, if you're working in an organization like that, you have to make it your own. But I think that's kind of all I was looking for right now, was something high level just to frame up our thinking. Brandon, I see you typed a response to Carrie's question in the Q&A panel, but Carrie was asking how we could approach making a flexible, agile L&D playbook in an organization that is historically driven by technology or by the tools that are being used, rather than the people and what they as learners and employees need. Can you kind of echo what you put into the chat?
Yeah, actually it's an excellent question, and having spent half my career in tech, I feel the pain that Carrie may be going through in some respect. And so it's really all about how do you influence the partnership needed from your practice with the business, right? Because it's understanding in tech, we have some of the most sort of diminishing skill sets. They diminish much faster and maybe aren't as durable in other parts of the business because of the way tech evolves and moves so fast. So it's like, I remember when I was in tech and I supported product managers, they needed to get in front of a business idea that might take a year to go to market. So they had to kind of predict what would be interesting for customers in a year because it took that long to go to market with something, right? And those go to market times have shrunk even more. So I think this is where it gets to the operating model of how the talent development function works, because you have to be a partner with the business, side by side with the business, like I said earlier, a little bit in front. So influencing your way into that conversation so that you are having it at the right time. A lot of times during my tech career, when I supported software, from a training perspective, we were a release version behind. And that's just not tenable nowadays. And so I think it goes to the structure of your organization and how you partner with the business. And that's the conversation that you need to get into so that you're seen as speaking the language of the business and aligning your scorecard metrics to those that matter to the business. That's just a fundamental in making sure that you are performance consulting with them and not just reacting as an order taker.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So one of the things that, this has been kind of echoing a lot of the things that that my team within ELB Learning has been working with. So we talked about L&D kind of living in this layer, ideally in this layer between the high level strategy of a business and what's happening at the execution level. So you're in between those two pieces of bread, to borrow a different type of metaphor. The strategy team that I head up at ELB Learning, it kind of operates in a similar space where we're thinking about the learning strategy for our customers, but we're also influencing the strategy that we take as a business to help our customers in the learning space. And what we've really tried to do over the last year or so is move into that product development mindset when it comes to the organization as a whole. When we talk about product development mindset, for me, we're talking about playbooks, and that influences the mindset that we have, that puts us in the right headspace, but it also really operationalizes in terms of a backlog. So we think about, okay, what are our goals based on the environment? What is our playbook telling us that we should be focusing on now? And then what is our backlog having us do in the next 4 to 12 weeks to bring that to life? And then it's just constant iteration of reviewing it and adapting it and moving things off and moving things up based on what we're seeing from parts of our business, but then also parts of the customers' organizations that we work with. And one thing I think that we've been saying throughout this presentation, but haven't really put a fine point on it, is that it is a conversation, right? You're making decisions about what goes up and down in the backlog, what's going to be highly prioritized now, and what's going to be slightly less prioritized. But you're never making those decisions unilaterally in a vacuum. You're always bringing people to your table saying, this is kind of what we're working on. Help me understand where your priorities are so I can shape my list of priorities in response. And I think that kind of helps keep things transparent throughout the organization. And it's one of the great reasons that, it's fun to set the table, because you can then kind of sometimes set the conversation as well and get people focused on having the right conversations. So we got a couple more questions in here, but I think we're going to set them just to the side for a little bit. Ryan, you had a couple of things that you wanted to talk about, maybe some specific examples?
Yeah, so one of a lot of you might know Christopher Lind, the CLO at ChenMed. They're one of our customers, and something that I give him a lot of credit to is he's a very good example at looking at how does a learning and development team maximize resources, especially during times where it seems harder to do that. And he focused on the operating model and building efficiencies within that to unlock time. So they were using Monday.com prior to Cognota, and there's just a lot of nuances and specificities to the work that L&D does, and it created a few data silos because it just encompassed the full workflow that and the operating model that L&D falls into. So they focused on that, and they were able to find a lot of operational efficiencies and time savings, to the point in the chat by adopting that product mindset, by aligning strategically to the business. And what that did was it saved the team a little over 6,000 hours, which was equivalent to almost 3 full-time employees or new team members without having to hire these people. So it's a really good example of working smarter, not harder, by focusing on the operational efficiencies. And you could do a lot more than that with the power of AI now as well. And when you think about your operating layer, how you strategically align to the business, when you take the time to really learn about what's being discussed around the table, that's when you can make the magic happen and really start telling those impact stories. So in this example, it's just about how do you tie your LearnOps data together with ROI frameworks. For example, the ROI methodology by Jack and Patty Phillips in this case, where if you really think about how your business operates, and that's how you should think of L&D, like a business, and you do these things properly, the pieces to telling the impact stories are there in front of you, right? So if you align yourself to be a strategic learning advisor or consultant to a business partner, how you kick off those requests is fundamentally important. There's a big difference in the questions you ask right off the bat. We were in a workshop earlier today, and somebody told us that they have a drop down in their intake process on which corporate objective does this align to, right? So right away, helping the business partners prioritize, does this even align to a business objective? And if not, like, what do we do with that? But also asking questions around what problem does this solve? Instead of jumping to the solution, what does success look like if we invest time and money into a program to help solve this problem? And what evidence will you, Mr. or Mrs. Business Partner, point us to? What business results or evidence will you point us to if we invest into this with you? And that then pushes back on the business right away to even the playing field between L&D and business partner. It becomes a true partnership. And again, you have a lot of leverage to then say downstream, hey, we've now delivered this. We spend this time and money into the program. You're not giving us that evidence. We're not going to iterate on this program until you do that for us. So a lot of times people think that you need to integrate into the business systems to start measuring impact or learning. But in fact, you can collect that from your business partners as well. So in this slide, it talks about the consultation process, really understanding what those objectives are, breaking down the objectives all the way down and laddering up to corporate objectives. Tying your systems and your processes to capture the data and the life cycle, time and cost, who worked on the programs, and getting to a point where you can now measure backwards to that success criteria you defined up front with your business partners to tell that full story. And there's been amazing examples that we've seen companies doing this with.
So we've got a little bit less than 10 minutes left in our session. And there was at least one really good question that came in the Q&A panel while Ryan was going through those last couple of slides. So Brandon, I'm wondering if you can reiterate You wrote it so well in the panel chat. You could probably just read it out and it would still kind of sparkle. So can you talk a little bit about how to address the C-suite?
Yeah, it's it's an interesting question because that's where we need to be closest to, candidly. And just last year, there was an article, I think it was in Fortune or Forbes, I don't remember, talking about how, in some respects, attracting the right CPO, Chief People Officer in the company, can be more complicated and complex and have a larger return than the right CEO, for example. So it's like it's just it shows how over the last several years the people practice has been elevated not only in visibility but in driving business results. And so I would say it's critical for us in our org structures and how we are situated within the enterprise, across the enterprise, to have that channel open to us to talk to the C-suite leaders. Because again, like I said, they're assertively doing the investment in technology, for example, and not necessarily investing with parity in the people development side of it. And so there's a massive gap or chasm that's opening up between the technology that's driving the business and what the customers expect and the investment in skilling and capability building that's necessary to deliver on that. So this conversation is critical. I think it's a great question that Robin asked. And I would say that the conversation with the CEO, if you're in the elevator or whatever, is really to talk about, if you get that question, what do you do? Right? And you really build capability in the company's most important asset, which is its people. And you need to ensure what you do every day with the passion that we bring to this, because we're people. We focus on building the capability needed to ensure that our people can meet the needs of the customer, full stop. And also, we preserve the humanity in the work, which sometimes gets a little bit removed from the conversation when the tech tsunami is like drowning us all, right? So I would say again, if someone asked me that in an elevator, my focus is building the capability needed to deliver on the customer's expectations.
I love the way that you said that. I'm gonna quote you on LinkedIn later for sure. Carrie asked another really good question just now, and that was, if you want to begin building a brand new playbook from scratch and you want to do it well, what kind of time and resource investments are you looking at? Knowing that if you take too long to create it, it might no longer be relevant, right? So you've got to move pretty quickly, but you also want to do a good job. How long does it take?
Yeah, it's a good question. The other thing to consider too is a lot of what the learn ops paradigm talks about, and why Ryan's conversation is so critical to what we do, and even the methodology that Cognota brings forward is really important, because it's not necessarily efficient to always be pivoting, right? Because a lot of what we do in the practice of creating capability building programs and solutions and products, you have to get it right a lot the first time. And you don't have a lot of iterative, I mean, sometimes you can, but not always, especially if it's safety and compliance. You have to get that right the first time. And sometimes it takes what it takes to do this. And so to have that flexibility in your playbook is to really deeply understand what is really critical to the business. And so when I worked at Apple several years ago, it was during the last stages of Steve being there. He used to tell us over and over that focus is what you say no to. That's your focus. And so understanding that your value as the L&D function lies in making sure that you can move the needle when it comes to what business imperatives are important is really you also being able to know that it's inefficient to pivot. If you have your team working on something and then you get an emerging need and you need to stop and move over to something else and then eventually move back, that's an inefficient way to do it. So how do you build your playbook to have affordances for those emerging needs that are going to come your way? And I know it's not real doable to reserve parts of your time, your employees' workforce time, to wait for these emerging needs, but you have to build in, think of how you build in that predictive analysis, scenario planning is what I like to call it, to figure out, okay, what are the rhythms of the business and what happens if we move these two or three things versus really just staying and focusing on these things that we know will move the needle and might be year over year. So I think it's kind of a constant sort of negotiation, right, that you're making. But once you make a decision to go in this direction, you've done the strategic needs analysis to go, no, this is an imperative that's important to the business. It might take a year, 18 months to do this, but this is something we really need to stay focused on. And then you need to continually have those conversations about what business value that drives, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay.
I love that 20% wiggle room in your L&D strategy. Right, exactly. What is your room for emerging needs? Because they're inevitably going to happen.
I would also say, I know we only have a minute or two, but to break apart strategy in the playbook, really understand what your strategy is first and why that's the strategy. Then think about what the playbook needs to be. And the playbook will encompass all of these things: your operating model, how you do business partnerships, your learning solutions marketplace, as Ellen showed, et cetera, et cetera. And to answer Sid's question, how would you recommend creating an L&D program? Not to give Brandon and I a plug, but in June, we're delivering a workshop together that's free for 4 hours on reinventing your learning operations. So that would be a good place to build your entire strategy.
So I think that brings us to the end of our session. Follow up for that June workshop. That sounds interesting. I'll probably see many of you there. Stephanie, you linked some resources in the chat, or you are working on that. Can you speak a little bit to where we can follow up on some of the ideas and takeaways from today's session?
Brandon supplied a ton of awesome resources, worksheets for starting out to create your playbook. All of those will be linked in the email with the recording. I posted what was supposed to be a zip file, but it's not working for everybody. So they will be in the recording. I'll link them with the YouTube video of this so that you can access them. Oh, it worked for some people. You know what? It just probably depends on your settings and firewall. All right. Ellen, did we answer all the questions?
We have one more. I know we're at time, but I'm wondering if we could just for a second point Bob to any resources or people who look at using playbooks in K-12 education.
I think that's a really good question. I think you could, not to give myself a shout out, but the book I wrote I think that could be leveraged as well. You know, in that space, but there are some differences I think that are unique and specific to the context. But I think if you just sort of take some of like that 10 steps in there on kind of how to do it, you could apply that, I think, to the context of almost anything when it comes to education or training.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you both. This was a great conversation. I'm so glad that the three of us had time to dive into this. And thank you for the participants, for asking such fantastic questions. We'll see you out there in the digital world or the physical one.
And you can keep an eye on your box for the email recording. It should be out by tomorrow. Oh, Brandon, what was the title of your book?
L&D's Playbook for the Digital Age, ATD Press.
Yeah.
Thanks.
If you Google Brandon Carson, L&D, I think you'll find it. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We hope to see you all on another webinar soon. Have a great rest of your day.